Hey there, this is DK Brainerd, back to talk to you about Chiron, the Wounded Healer. So, in the last video, we looked at Chiron's astrological data and mythology symbolism. In this video, we're going to explore the wounded part of Wounded Healer. So, as we get older and learn about Chiron in our natal horoscope, we find that the Chiron wound always shows up in childhood events. And this is clearly shown in the Chiron myth. So we saw last week's video, that Chiron was abandoned by his mother, who was apparently repulsed by him. Also, his father was absent, so he was the child of rape, and his father, never planned on sticking around. And as we looked at in the previous video, astrological Chiron always points to the divide between the animal and the rational within us. So the Chiron wound, always administered in childhood, always shows up in childhood. And we're going to look in future videos at how we can tune in more to that nature of that wound through the house and sign placements of Chiron, and through the aspects to Chiron in the natal chart. But just trying to lay out the basics here so you can get a sense of what Chiron's energy is like. So that divide between, half horse, half human, right? The centaurs, there's a divide between the head and the heart, between the spirit and the body, or the mind and the body. We could also look at that divide as being between instinct and reason, impulse versus order, the lust or the physical drives and instincts versus mores and social conventions. So what we're supposed to do as a good citizen, as a good member of the slave planet, right? And in the myth, Chiron is found and mentored by Apollo. So Apollo is the most rational of the major gods, the male gods anyway. Apollo is the sun god. He represents divine order, and he is the model or the epitome of civilized behavior. So we could contrast that with Dionysus or Bacchus, who is the exaltation of the animal passions. So Chiron wasn't found and mentored by Dionysus. He was found and mentored by Apollo. And, I feel like in the myth, there's a, maybe not too explicit, but if we look at Chiron's behavior in adulthood, becoming this healer, teacher, wise man, mentor, the leader of the centaurs, the diplomat who tried to rein in their lusts and passions and wildness, destructive kind of with the sort of rational side of the self or the animal physical side of the self. If we go too far to either extreme, we're going to introduce imbalance. We're going to introduce eventually needless suffering, right? So the fact that Chiron was adopted and mentored by Apollo indicates that there's an overemphasis on the rational, rational, mental, civilized, self-control kind of side of the equation, as opposed to the Dionysian excess that was in abundance with the other centaurs. So interestingly, this is a theme that we often see in the healing and helping professions. So the psychologist who is drawn to psychology to try to heal the craziness that he senses within him, the madness, the depression, the despair, whatever, and hides his own, and this is part of the profession, right? Is you hide your own craziness under this veneer of patient, impassive professionalism, neutrality. And we see it a lot with healers, alternative healers, new age healers. It's something I definitely recognize in my own life of, the person who gives constantly to her clients or her patients, her massage therapy clients, her Reiki clients, your astrology clients, and is always focused on helping others heal, but never is able to give to self. in the same way that they give to their clients. So to me, this is one of the things that the Chiron myth expresses, and with all myths, we're forced to do a lot of reading between the lines. And as I said in my recent, what was that? Decode your chart with degree symbols. We talked about Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist, and his idea that any part of a myth is a valid part of that myth, any addition to a myth. So I don't want to go off on that tangent, but I definitely feel that Chiron in adulthood represented this overbalancing or reactionary kind of push to his traumatic childhood and abandonment, and his mother being repulsed at his half human, half animal form, and really embodied the Apollonian attributes of, righteous, civilized behavior. So in the last video, I mentioned the resonance between Chiron and Jesus Christ. Interestingly, one of my favorite William Blake quotes is that Jesus acted from impulse, never from reason. So one of the things that I feel Chiron teaches us is that we need to honor our impulses and our needs and our physical drives, as well as the rational side of the self, as well as the mind. Let's talk for a minute about transcending and integrating Chiron. So James Hillman, the great archetypal psychologist, said that the soul communicates through pathologizing. So when Chiron is wounded by Hercules' poison arrow, and we could also go back and say when Chiron is wounded by his being born a freak, right? By his being abandoned by his mother, by both his mother and father being gone. So basically being orphaned. But Chiron's wound and his inability to heal that wound. So reminder from the first video that the Chiron wound is often, it feels like the wound that can never be healed, the wound that never heals. But Chiron's wounding by Hercules' poison arrow ultimately led to a transcendence of his divided state. So Chiron being wounded by one of Hercules' poison arrows is also revealing of the nature of the chirotic wound that each of us experiences with Chiron in our natal charts. And I feel like it also shows how the axiom of working with Chiron astrologically, that healing through Chiron or healing the Chiron wound always takes place through increasing our awareness. So Hercules in myth, right, symbolizes the ideal man. He's the hero. He's the champion of civilization against the monsters and outsiders in the world. And within the psyche, Hercules is the heroic ego. So Hercules is the ego subduing the unruly fears, drives, and desires that live in the unconscious mind, the scary monsters that we're taught to repress as part of our domestication or socialization into society. James Hillman calls the ego inflated to constant fixation on the heroic, which is, in a way what Hercules symbolizes throughout the Greek mythology. Hillman calls this the sin of satanic selfhood. So it's the ego, we need a healthy ego. We need an ego to function in the world. And we'll talk about that more in a second in terms of the Chiron myth. But Hillman says that when we allow the ego to elevate itself to the position of hero and to basically be possessed by or merge with the hero archetype. And so I look at the archetypes as these inorganic, energetic beings or containers that have a specific flavor, a specific purpose, a specific thing that they want to do in the world. And they need us, they need humans to come through into the world and to basically, find some embodiment and be able to function in the world. So when the ego merges with the Herculean, heroic, all-conquering, work all the time, very masculine, kind of patriarchal energy, then Hillman says this is the sin of satanic selfhood. It's the self-elevated, just as Satan elevated himself above the creator, right? That this is the ego elevating itself above the soul and saying, I know what's best. I'm gonna fix everything. So the inflated ego, the heroic ego, interestingly, is always going to keep firing off poison arrows at the soul. Now, is it doing that on purpose? Who knows? Maybe it's doing it because, it's like, I always feel like the ego that is just striving for total control and, total lockdown. Not going to mention any recent events in society, but there's an inflated ego and inflated need to control, right? That we've all just lived through. But it's trying to keep us safe, but it's doing it in this satanic, materialistic, very obsessed, very solipsistic way of functioning. And so in that process of being, on the hill and like fighting off all the invaders and trying to crush and repress the monsters, sooner or later, there's some friendly fire that's going to hit us in the soul. And so, that energy or that maxim of Hillman's, which I find to be true, the soul always communicates through pathologizing. It's our very woundedness, our sickness, our shortcomings, our struggles, our lack that leads us out of the material surface level of dealing with the world, the matrix level, and into the soul, and into a place of humility and seeking and openness to receive the gifts of the soul and to really integrate all the stuff that we've been taught to fear and repress, and then reemerge as a really powerful, transcendent, radiant being that I believe is our birthright. It's who we were meant to be. So it's interesting that Hercules is the one who intercedes with Zeus and allows for Chiron's, what would otherwise be his eternal suffering, to come to an end. And then Chiron is, translated or transcends to his heavenly kind of destination, his heavenly dharma of being among the stars, being the constellation Centaurus, right? So to me, there's a cue in the myth that the ego is actually necessary for healing, and in that moment where Hercules is interceding on behalf of Chiron, he's feeling remorse, or he didn't, Chiron was a good guy, right? Chiron's always trying to rein in the other centaurs and keep them in line and stop them from overemphasizing the animal side and, destroying, raping, pillaging, all that stuff. So there's a humility and an ability to take away from that heroic control, domination, kill all the bad guys kind of energy that Hercules embodies in the myth, and to have compassion and be willing to put himself in a very vulnerable position before the king of the gods, asking for, this exchange with Prometheus to take place. So we need the ego, but we also, part of the Chiron healing journey is to be able to recognize where the ego has taken over the psyche or has been co-opted by the matrix, by some of the archetypes in the world. And any archetypal possession, it can be fun for a short time, but we don't want to be living possessed by an archetype or a complex of archetypes. So I feel like that's a really interesting key, the Chiron symbol in the myth. And then the last thing I want to say about that in this video is that Prometheus and Chiron, so I talked about in the first video the connection between those two archetypal figures. Prometheus is the champion of humanity vis-a-vis the gods. So Chiron's self-sacrifice by trading places with Prometheus, even though that was necessary for Chiron to get relief from his, otherwise eternal agony, is very much a redemption of Prometheus. And I feel is an affirmation of humanity and an affirmation of our place among the gods, our place in the cosmos, our rightful place. So it's very much, even in his dying moments, Chiron is functioning as this healer and as this Christ-like redeemer figure. So pretty cool, if you ask me. Chiron's he's a great being, a great archetype. I love Chiron. I've found so much healing through working with Chiron in my chart. And in the next video, we're going to talk more about specific modalities and methods, ways of working with Chiron to heal our lives, to heal ourselves. And then we'll go on in subsequent videos and look at Chiron in the zodiac signs, and each of the signs, look at Chiron through the houses, so that you can get a better sense of what Chiron's representing in your chart and how you can work with him too. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you found this helpful. Until next time, this is astrologer DK Brainerd saying, may you go with the stars.